In November of 2007, I published and released my books, The Irish Origins of Civilization, in 2 volumes. Volume 1 is titled and has the subtitle, The Servants of Truth, Druidic Traditions and Influence Explored. So it's a look at Irish Druidism. Volume 2, the title and subtitles were Akhenaten, the Cult of Aton and the Dark Side of the Sun, Polemical Investigations into the Extermination of Druidry and the Rise of Judeo-Christianity. These books, The Irish Origins of Civilization, follow on nicely from my first book, Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation. In that original book, we talked about the Irish, the ancient legends of the Irish, and how they also talked about the War of the Gods, super technologies, and also the end of what is known as the antediluvian or pre-diluvian world. These are civilizations that were very ancient that are now lost. The Irish Origins volumes pick up the story of what happened in the world after the Great Age of Catastrophe, after the advent of evil into the world and also into the consciousness of human beings, and after the fall of Atlantis. If we accept that Atlantis existed, what happened to it? The Irish Origins books picks up with the story of mankind and the story of civilization after the decline of the great civilizations of the ancient world, which scientists, even though the evidence is in front of their eyes, are very hesitant to accept existed. But for those who don't know me or my work or are not familiar with this particular thesis, we'll do a little mini introduction. And I'd like to read the caption on the back of Volume 2. What does it mean to live in the age of revealing? It means the light that royals and their secret society masters apparently adore is finally being shone brightly upon their own orders and ideologies. It means that the sun of truth has finally risen to expose their once hidden machinery of tyranny and control. For those hot on the trail of the world's premier secret societies, this book will be an invaluable source of revelation. It alone reveals the intelligence behind royalty, masonry, Zionism, and Judeo-Christianity. Now, of course, people will stop and say, first of all, how is Volume 1 talking about Ireland and Volume 2 about Egypt? Officially, there's not meant to be a connection between Ireland and Egypt. But of course, as we unfold in this presentation, we will see that that is far from the truth. Another question will arise, why are we talking about secret societies? What's that got to do with anything? Again, we have to realize that the history that we have accepted, that comes down from the establishment figures, is largely fabricated and untrue. And that these books are very much controversial. They are not fitting into the normal academic sphere of thought. These books are controversial in the sense that they are alternative. There's an alternative reading of history, which goes against or flies in the face of what we're taught in the schools and colleges. Now, in both books you'll find dedications to various authors, even some musicians and people that I consider mentors, but the books are also dedicated and addressed to the spirit of humanity. Just as human beings have a spirit that can sometimes be oppressed or occluded, so we can surmise or conjecture that humanity also has a spirit. And we can also conclude that in the age that we find ourselves today, that spirit is oppressed. That spirit is sort of occluded and held down or suppressed, just like a human spirit or a human mind or a human soul can be. And that one day that spirit may rise. We can talk about the countdown to 2012, and perhaps there is already some sort of awakening taking place. But my work and these volumes, these books, are dedicated to that spirit and to the time of its final awakening. Because, as many philosophers have said, you can't suppress a good idea forever. Truth will not be thrown to the ground perpetually. The books are also dedicated and addressed to the beginner. And what is a beginner? What am I talking about by beginner? I mean the person who comes to this kind of controversial material for the first time. People who investigate alternative history, or the conspiratorial so-called movement. Those individuals may be lost. They may have a great passion to know the truth. They may be full of the Sturm und Drang, as the Germans would say, and they come with great gusto because they sense that they haven't been told all the truth about the world and about history and about consciousness. But they also may find themselves somewhat lost because there's a welter of information, not all of it accurate, not all of it true. So I'm very conscious of the mind of the beginner, and that a person doesn't necessarily have the 20-30 years to work it all out, and that the freshness and the passion that comes with a beginner is very important, and they shouldn't stop or get waylaid or get so confused that the process ends because they're not getting their answers. It's very important that the people who are seasoned in this, they're always concerned not just about the choir and the people who know or think they know about this subject matter, but those who are ever new, coming in with a lot of questions. The books are also dedicated to the insider. What insider? Well, who is it that works in the corporations of the world, in the corporate bodies? Who is it that works inside the religions? Who is it works inside the technical companies and corporations of the world? Who works inside the military? Who works inside the churches? Who works in the government? You do. The people watching this. And you may feel that you are unimportant or insignificant, but in fact, being an insider, as we'll see in a minute, is very, very important, because you are actually positioned in an exceptionally a good place to make some vital changes, should those be needed. The message to the insider, in short, is don't be treated as a machine or as machine man. Your position, from your position, you can observe, you can record, you can leak information, you can publish information, and ultimately you can expose what you see and what is going on. And you can do that secretly. You also need to realize, you see, that you may be a moral person. You may be a God-loving and a true and moral, virtuous individual. But the people that you may be working for in those corporations may not be so moral or so pure. After all, as Joel Bakan showed in his fine work, The Corporation, corporations can be psychopathic. Corporations can be run by psychopathic people. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work that out. And if you're working inside a corporation like that, or you're working inside a business or a concern where you see the vilest of actions and the most immoral acts, the so-called white-collar crime that goes on, which is ubiquitous, perhaps you can document it. Perhaps now with the internet, you're in a good position to be able to leak it and tell the world just what's going on, and thereby affect very important changes. The message to the insider is perfectly summed up by the philosopher Ayn Rand. If one values human life, she said, one cannot value its destroyers. Well, isn't that the same message that was spoken by Socrates in the 4th century BC, when he said to harm another is to harm oneself? So it's a matter of responsibility. If you're working in the corporations that are exploitative and are bringing misery to the world, there's something you can do by exposing the dirty little secrets or the dirty big secrets of government, of politics, of religion. Now, it might take some convincing for people to do this, but as we saw in the case of, for instance, Scott Ritter, he comes to mind, United Nations weapon inspector, who just had it up to here with the lies and the duplicity of the governments who had sent him in to inspect the weapons in Iraq. And now he is come out to expose that and to show just what kind of duplicity it was going on. I mean, he's the kind of person, if he ran for office, you might even want to vote him in as president, because here's a typical example of an insider who couldn't take it anymore and started to turn the tables. The message to the beginner, well, that's a very simple message, actually, because people scream to me all the time about what can I do, and everything seems so hopeless. Actually, the answers, the solutions are grassroots, and they're more simple than you'd possibly realize. The message to the beginner is to be mad as hell, as they say, to get so angry with what is going on that you affect change that way. See, anger is there for a reason. We've been told a pack of lies about the emotions. Certain emotions exist for certain reasons. and used correctly and understood correctly in their true psychological context, they can be the spark, they can be the motive to cause great change. But first of all, just like the movie network said, you have to be mad as hell in order to get something done. And so if you see injustices, if you see something that's broken, warped, or rotten, you shouldn't feel all right about it. It's not good to just roll over and go to sleep as if it didn't exist. It's not good to get into all forms of escapism and excuse mechanisms. It's essential to be mad about what you see going on in the world and around you. Jules Henry, the American anthropologist, said to think deeply in our culture is to grow angry and to anger others. And if you cannot tolerate this anger, you are wasting the time you spend thinking deeply. One of the rewards of deep thought is the hot glow of anger at discovering a wrong. But if anger is taboo, then thought will starve to death. The message to the beginner is also summarized by J. Krishnamurti, the Indian philosopher, who said, "Till the false is seen as the false, truth is not." He's talking here about apophatic learning. See that which is false. Through your critical abilities, through your judgment, through your doubt, and also using things like pattern recognition. Analyze the situation, analyze what is in front of you, see it as untrue. My work is very much built out of that, of constantly being skeptical and doubting what I've been told from official sources. And when Krishnamurti is saying, when you see this false, as false, perhaps then you will develop the ability to see what is true amid all those lies and falsehoods. But see, to be able to do that requires attitudinal independence. I mean, independence, after all, is about here. Independence is about what you have in the mind. Because it's not some fashion statement, it's not some cosmetic statement, it's not some allegiance, petty allegiance, or affiliation. Some of the freest men have been those who've been locked up in prison or thrown into dungeons. Always remember that true independence, that word is bandied around so much we sometimes forget this, but true independence is attitudinal, it's of the mind. And then later, it's of your behavior and your personality and so on. But today, we have to develop an independence against the collective, the consensus trance. And of course, we know where we need to go if we don't want to have that independence. We go to the normal media, which is happy to tell us what we should do and what we should believe and how we should think. The independent person has what I always describe as psychic immunity. He's unmutual. He doesn't want to go along to get along, and he questions and he doubts. And the work of alternative historians like myself is basically applicable to those individuals. That doesn't mean we're right. That doesn't mean we have all the answers or that we're experts in anything. But it means that we're looking at knowledge, we're looking at the world in a slightly different way. And therefore that will only be of interest to those who have independent minds. But again, those individuals who've made that choice, subliminally or liminally, to not do that, we know where they go. They go to the circus, the juggling act, the daily, nightly news, the spiel, the spin of all the hucksters whose attitudes and their statements are doctored. So many fine books have been written on this very process. But let's not ever doubt that it does succeed in forcing people into consensus trance and lockstep. So they give us an idea of democracy. They give us an idea of freedom. They bandy words around like independence and individuality. But do we really have those things? Are we not in an oligarchy, a plutocracy? The message to the beginner continues also with a statement from J.F. Kennedy. He said, "Fear not the path of truth for the lack of people walking on it." Again, the essence is independence. I highlighted the word fear there because fear needs to be studied, just like anger needs to be re-understood. So does fear. We have to understand what it is in society that makes us afraid. Is there an entire Leviathan out there? A whole media apparatus that instills fear into us and anxiety and trepidation until people are frozen and they can't think correctly? And that fear is there to make sure that you remain within the walls of the known and the walls of the established traditions. So we need to study fear and find out what it is and where it leads, and whether it's really coming from our own selves or whether there is a injection of fear daily in the world that prevents us from coming to understand the meaning of life. Marcel Proust said, "We don't receive wisdom, we must discover it for ourselves after a journey that no one can take for us or spare us." And this is a very, very important statement. Again, the emphasis is on independence. Jack Trout, in his book Positioning, The Battle for Your Mind, addressed this concept of breaking the consensus and learning to say no. He says the sane person constantly analyzes the world of reality and then changes what's inside his or her head to fit the facts. That's an awful lot of trouble for most people. Besides, how many people want to constantly change their opinions to fit the facts? It's a whole lot easier to change the facts to fit your opinions. Unsane people make up their minds and they find the facts to verify their opinions. Or, even more commonly, they accept the opinion of the nearest expert, and then they don't have to bother about the facts at all. The main message of Michael Tsarian to the world is to never leave consciousness at the door, so that we always understand, we remain vigilant to understand that no matter how many permutations this great war takes, and how many violations there are, both political or economic or social, let us never leave consciousness at the door. Let us never forget that the real war is a war on consciousness. It's a psychic war, a psychic dictatorship. I constantly emphasize this throughout all my work, and it's the key. Because we think of colonization and colonialization primarily in political terms. When somebody mentions those words, we think of militaristic terms or a political movement. We have to start to learn to think of those terms in mental and spiritual and psychic terms. There's a colonization of the mind, and it's vital for us to be vigilant and aware of that all the time. And there's many tentacles of that kind of colonization. There's many tentacles of this war on consciousness. As we said, historical amnesia. We're not taught about history correctly. There's the groupthink and the consensus trance, which is again born out of fear. Or we have a complete and utter disinterest in anything that's not the most narcissistic and practical areas of life, and we have, especially amongst the young and amongst the teenagers, the vegged out, the boredom, which is so prevalent in our societies today. We also have overstimulated minds, and scientists know, behaviorists know, those who study consciousness know, that if a mind is perpetually and constantly overstimulated with the stimuli of the world, it basically freezes and is incapable of real thought. It's certainly not capable of what we talked about a few minutes ago, the apophatic learning, the deductive reasoning, the critical judgment. In fact, in our society today, you're almost criticized if you're critical. You're criticized if you are skeptical. You're criticized if you have a higher form of judgment. We're living in societies that don't want you to make fine judgments. It doesn't want you to assess the facts and come to your own independent understanding. But we have thinking, and the finest part of reasoning, a part of thinking, is the reason. The human reason is what separates us from the rest of creation. And the reason is critical understanding and judgment. So we don't need to have these things weakened. We need to have them strengthened in our society, and that is again against the flow of what the establishment wants. The power brokers don't want us to be critical thinkers, forming rational judgments and using those abilities. What they want is to have us overstimulated so that the mind ultimately shuts down. They want us sense infatuated. There's nothing wrong with sensation, but look at the world we're living in right now. We're in a world of outer directed personality types as opposed to inner directed. Do we know what the difference is between an inner directed person, a person who's got selfhood and psychic sovereignty or psychic immunity, or a perpetually outer directed person who's waiting for the world to turn them on, who's waiting for the world to give them meaning? You may be bumping into such people You may have them in your family. You may be working right beside such people. Isn't it important for you to understand what their psychic profile is, what their psychological type is? Might that not answer a great deal of your own existential issues and problems? We have, of course, a pornographic media. We have an unspeakable barrage of nonsense generated by ubiquitous media oracles. I've gone this into other works, other DVDs, other presentations about exactly how that works, because it's another form of psychic tyranny that is again designed and created to erode your sense of independence, to befuddle, to confuse, to insert and embed all sorts of negative memes and thought patterns, you see, and to work on also the limbic areas of our brain, and to work on what the Eastern Vedic people would call the lower chakra drives. And what is the result of that? Well, the delinquency and the addiction that we see all around us in the world today. Slowly and slowly, more people are becoming toxic and unsane, even insane. Now, in other presentations, other work, I've talked about this rising of toxicity, specifically of the human emotions. Where are we going with this? The beginner asks these questions. What is the future of mankind? Where is mankind heading? Are we heading for a terminal? Are we terminal? Are we heading for some sort of apocalypse? That could be very much the case if the world chooses, if human beings choose, as they seem to be choosing, to not face their emotions, or they simply don't even have the equipment or the strength of will to face toxic negative emotions, because we've been conditioned to think in negative terms about our own emotions. And I've spoken about this in other work. And that if we do continually avoid dealing with the emotions, what will happen to humanity? Will people become one-dimensional, paper-thin, or will those emotions start coming back? As the psychologists have always said, the repressed content, the content you don't want to look at, has a strange habit of coming back. Now, the Maya talked about a countdown to the age of awakening, the age of enlightenment, the age of revelation. Is that one way of saying that we are going to inherit the shadows that we have projected into the world? And when we look out into the social world today, into what's happening in the world today, is that what we're seeing unfold? How much does our own psychic profile, you see, bring into being the world that we have to live in? So, those two important areas. The healthy anger, the blue flame of anger, which is born from a total, clear understanding of the world, a zero tolerance of lies and falsehood, the ability to fall in love with the word no, and that idea that all forms of independence are never given to you by your master. The world is never going to make you free. The world is never going to make you independent. That is a gift that you give yourself through your own abilities, through your own, just as you give the world meaning. Instead of waiting for the world to give you meaning, you give meaning to the world from within inside yourself, if you're capable of doing that. And with that is the psychic immunity and also the attitudinal independence. Because the person who has these things, who's psychically immune, who's spiritually sovereign, who's moral, virtuous, who's using his critical judgment, who's centered in himself, he is completely secure no matter what kind of nonsense arrives in the world tomorrow. He's also pinpointed where the source of the fear is coming from, and he makes himself immune to that. All of these factors is what makes a true rebel, a true iconoclast, a true free thinker. This whole idea of the age of revelation or awakening, a kind of apocalypse, a kind of critical mass, in which there is perhaps a splitting of the ways. People who are not happy and have no interest in facing their own emotions, they start slipping, sliding, going down. And those individuals who are capable of doing that, another road opens up for them. Was this what the Maya were talking about? I've dealt with that in a DVD presentation, 2012, Where History Ends, in which we look at this whole question of the countdown to that year and fulfilling the old Maya prophecies. Will that mean many uncomfortable revelations and changes? Or will it mean new paradigms, grassroots solutions, a deeper sense of selfhood, and again ultimately independence from this collective? Will it mean an age of solutions in which we start to remedy with very simple ideas the problems that we've had for many millennia? Now we can move on from the introduction to look more deeply at what the Irish Origins of Civilization books are really about, and do a bit of a synopsis. In Chapter 1 of Volume 1, we address certain topics that the book addresses, or the volumes address. One of them is this key theme, and that is the west to east movement of the elements of civilization. And the elements of civilization are writing, music, language, basket weaving, pottery making, sailboats, all sorts of elements of civilization, the things we take for granted: astronomy, astrology, theology, horseback riding, various elements that make up civilization. Of course, we know that we're taught from official sources that basically those elements reach the west from the east. But my work looks into whether the opposite is in fact true. Whether after the fall of Atlantis, the elements of civilization moved into Britain, Scandinavia, through Europe and over to the east. In my mind, there's no reason why we shouldn't look at that question openly and objectively. We look into the Irish, or more properly, the Aryan origins of civilization. We look at the ancient roots of modern tyranny. We look at proofs that the British Isles were part of Atlantis. So rather than being a continent that sank beneath the waves, was actually Atlantis, is Britain, that's Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and England, and maybe even Iceland or Scandinavia. Are these actually remnants of the great continent of Atlantis? We look at the prehistoric age of catastrophe that ruined the world and traumatized consciousness. That's why I had to start with the Atlantis book first, because in order to understand the world we're living in and how the mechanisms and machinery of control exist, or how the empires and great civilizations came into existence, it's not possible to do that without sketching in the whole story of the pre-Diluvian civilizations. So when history books and history teachers pick up from whatever point BC, they habitually do not talk about these ancient cycles or antediluvian or pre-Diluvian cycles. That's often relegated to the realm of mythology. These are mythological cycles. But in my belief, we can never understand the origins of the modern world if we do not fully understand that there were civilizations of great advancement in ancient times. This is fundamental, and the world still has basically to wake up to this, although that is happening slowly. We look into the whole story of evil, and that evil, what we call evil, is a relatively recent phenomena. This book, Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation, deals with the origins of evil. It also says in the introduction of that book that within the next 10 years, and this book was written around about 2000, 2001, or 2002, so it said that within 10 years of the writing of this book, humanity would know a lot more about its origins and its destiny than it has done in the past. And we're already now at 2008, and I believe that that prophecy is fulfilled and will continue to be fulfilled, because we are every day, every week, every month, there's more information coming in that shatter the old sacred cows and completely bury all this nonsense, both in the science world and in archaeology and so forth, that we've been told. And hopefully soon, this whole question of how man becomes the sadistic creature that he is will also warrant a re-evaluation. The book, of course, as we saw in the titles, looks into who were the Druids, what were they about. It also looks into the story of the annihilation of the Druids, the high priests of the world, and that's why the second book deals with Egypt. Not only because there were legitimate connections between Ireland and Egypt, but because if you really want to understand why the Druids are not around today, not the authentic Druids anyway. That story takes us to Egypt, and we'll look into that as the presentation continues. The books deal with the restoration of the term, the much abused term, Arya or Aryan, and gets into what that word really meant. We look into whether we should be dispensing with the prejudicial and inaccurate term Celtic when referring to Ireland's megalithic inhabitants. Some scholars are questioning whether the term Celtic should be used even to deal with later groups who allegedly visited Ireland. But we certainly have always taken exception to the fact that it is used to describe the ancient Mesolithic or megalithic Irish. The books delve into and look into the all-important connections, and they are all-important, between Ireland and Egypt, as we said. It also looks into the connections, if any, between some of the most fascinating nations and tribes and peoples of the ancient world. Groups like the Scythians, the Hyksos, the Celts, the Gaels, the Sumerians, the Chaldeans, the Amorites, and the Indians of the Indus Valley, etc. The books investigate the origins of what we call monotheism, and that of course means delving into the origins of Judeo-Christianity, the famous religion of Judeo-Christianity. And my work looks into the Atenist and the British connections, which basically refutes what we've been told commonly about the origins of the religion. We cannot hope to be looking into the Druids and what they believed and what they taught without examining astrotheology, the religion of the stars. In fact, in 2008, I released an entire book on that subject, Astrotheology and Sidereal Mythology, which looks at the connections again, continues to look at the connections between Egypt and Ireland, but delves into what these ancient peoples believed, and shows that astrology played an enormous part in the religions of the ancient world, and that the great stellar cults, the teachings and the traditions of the Egyptian and the Irish stellar cult, this is a worldwide global college of adepts, was cannibalized and plagiarized by potentates and priesthoods of later generations. An absolutely fundamental study which delves into symbolism and all sorts of belief systems that we have still today in our world. The book looks at the Irish and Egyptian symbolism that proliferates. Did it go from the east to the west? Did it go from the west to the east? Or a bit of both? We need to clarify that whole question of why certain Egyptian symbols appear frequently in civic architecture of the West, on flags, on heraldry, on coins, on buildings, and even in the commercial world, in advertising. One only needs to look at how common the symbol of the pyramid is, for instance, or the symbol of the sun, or the pentagram. Not that these symbols are negative, but just like people, they have a date of birth and an origin. Where do they come from, what do they mean, and why are they being used? Crucially, as we said in the introduction, my work looks into the origin of the world's premier secret societies, because that is an area in which there is so much bunk talked. That's where there are so many misguided theories, or, shall we say, shallow research. Everyone has their 2 cents about the pyramid and the Egyptian symbolism, you see, and the origin of the Freemasonry or Templars, but that's a trail that can be investigated. And it's marvelously interesting when you find out who these people are, the elites, what they believed, who taught the elites of these secret societies, and how did they gain their control? How did they come to have the power and the control that they have? There's an incredible story there to be told about these Illuminists and Templars, and about the solar cults and the stellar cults of the ancient world. Specifically, the book deals with the Templars, this is the Knights Templar, and their connection to Ireland, which often hasn't been delved into sufficiently. But recently information has been coming out to show about the connection between the ancient land of Ireland and about the connection of Irish monks called the Chaldean monks to the Knights Templar, and also to the Cistercian order and ultimately to the royals who conquered England and Ireland, French royalty. The book delves into these connections. Volume 1 goes deeply into it, and also does Volume 2. Now that we've looked at some of the major themes of the Irish origins of civilization, let's turn to look at some of the fallacies of history, that which we have taken as fact in previous ages. What are man's truths? As the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche addressed this and said, "Our truths, are they merely our irrefutable errors?" Well, my work specifically addresses these falsehoods that we've accepted as facts. It addresses who the creators of these falsehoods are, and the reasons why human beings are not told the truth about their origins and about their religions, etc. As the great scholar Conor McDowry wrote, he said, "The generally accepted history of ancient times, such as is found on the shelves of our libraries and taught in our schools, is mostly fiction, made up of fables and myths, cleverly composed into histories so nicely as to lull all suspicion in the mind of the reader or student as to the fraudulent character of it. Some wonderfully clever writers have been led astray by these deceptions of history." We are creatures of historical amnesia. We're not being told the truth about history and where we've come from. And as the Egyptian priests said to Solon, the father of Plato, "In mind you are all young. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age." So what are these fictions and fallacies? Well, there's a whole list of them in the first chapter of Volume 1. One of the most common fallacies is the one that states that there were no advanced pre-Diluvian civilizations. Now the word diluvian simply means flood. The flood of the biblical tradition, the flood of archaeology. We know, archaeologists know, geologists understand that there was some kind of deluge, some kind of flood. Some localize it to the Mediterranean area, to the Euphrates, to the Caspian Sea. Other scholars like Macadari, Commons Beaumont, Immanuel Velikovsky, my mentors, talk about it being basically universal, a worldwide cataclysm, not localized to one area, although subsequent cataclysms or catastrophes may have been local to certain regions. But at one point, since almost all the tribes and nations of the world talk about it and write about it and have portrayed it in their cave art or whatever, and in their ancient books and legends and the folk tales, we have to start getting around the idea that this deluge was universal, global, worldwide. Another incredible but widely disseminated myth concerning ancient times is that basically primitive man was rude and malevolent. Of course, we are the advanced ones, we are progressed, and we are the evolved ones. And of course, we've stated so many other times in other works, yeah, that may be the case technologically, scientifically. Nobody's bashing technology, far from it. Scientifically, technically, modern man is supreme. He's very developed. He's made leaps and bounds in these areas. But wait a minute, what about psychologically? What about morally? What about spiritually? What about, other areas of the intellect? And even what about socially? So, is it really true? Can we, when we look back to the Neanderthals, to the Cro-Magnon, when we look back to so-called primitive tribes that are even existing today and their ancestors, or when we examine the ancestors of the people today in the West, are they really uncivilized? Were they really rude and primitive? These are philosophies and ideas and ideologies, you see, that every day they're getting less and less credible. And then what about the megalithic ruins throughout the world? Were they constructed by unrelated races? So when you go to France and see the megaliths there, is that a different group than the people who were building them in Britain? If you see some in Cornwall, but you see some in Brittany, or you see some up at the Isle of Skye in Scotland, or you see some in Norway and Sweden, and you can even find them in Armenia. We've even some in North Africa now. Megaliths that you wouldn't have been able to see unless you had the power of flight or satellite imagery. But we have always been told that these were created by basically unrelated groups. Is that in fact true? And also we've been told, of course, that the ambassadors of civilization were the Greeks, the Romans, and the Jews. We can deal with the elements of civilization and whether they were truly brought by a so-called chosen people from the eastern hemisphere of the world to the west. So were the ambassadors of civilization really the Greeks, the Romans, and the Jews, as we've been consistently taught? And these elements of civilization, were they truly brought west by a so-called chosen people, the 10 tribes of Israel, the prophet Jeremiah, and so on, as we've been taught? We've also been taught that these people that go by the name Jews were uniquely distinguished in the world, that they possessed a naturally religious and moral disposition, and were truly a God-inspired, chosen people. Well, we've been taught that the Babylonians were hedonistic, pornographic, sense-infatuated rabble-rousers. We've been told that the Nordics and the Teutons were warlike maniacs. We've been taught that the Druids were sacrificers of human beings and had a penchant for the wicker man and all sorts of things. We were told this about the Native American Indians, about the Aboriginals. Everybody else is rude, crude, and violent, but one small group from the East was uniquely distinguished. We've been told that the Jews were the first monotheists. And of course, as I'm implying, that might be a fallacy. What is monotheism? Were the Jews the first monotheists? We were told, after all, that the Jews were poor slaves in Egypt and hard-pressed to preserve their unique identity and beliefs. But even the top Jewish historians have long refuted that idea. There's no evidence that they were poor, oppressed slaves in the first place. And even the top Jewish historians have long refuted this. Yet the common man, upon questioning, would obviously, many media presentations and movies still cling to this old idea. Crucially, we're also told that the Bible provides accurate accounts of historical occurrences. And maybe that's true. But what happens if, in fact, the Bible really shouldn't be taken as history? What happens if, just like all the other scientists have relegated the myths of Ireland and the myths of Scandinavia to mythology, perhaps the Bible is also mythology, as well as theology? See, archaeologically, the Bible doesn't make good history, despite what we've been told. We've been told that the Jews were Semites, and then linguists and anthropologists have had to let go of that term. It's an unsustainable term, which has very little meaning. Recent scholarship, recent researches shows that the Jews were in fact anything but Semites. The true Jews, that is. We've been told that Egyptian religion and culture had no effect on Jewish beliefs and lifestyle. The Jewish rabbis, Judaism in particular, Christianity even, pays no debt of homage to Egypt at all. And we are now discovering that this is a huge fallacy, that Egypt very much played a role in the origins of Judaism. We've been told that the Hebrew language, so-called, has no connection to the Egyptian or the Gaelic. My work shows, like other people's work have shown, that there's an intimate connection between what we call the Hebrew language and Egyptian. And that's so much so, in fact, that what we call Hebrew might even be a form of Egyptian, the lost language of Egypt. Because the Egyptians didn't only write in hieroglyphics. They had another normal style of writing. Where did it go? Scholars have pointed out that that might be the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Now that's earth-shattering in its implications. We've been told that the Israelites were not given to idolatry. That's right, we've been told that the Israelites were monotheists and that they had no time for idolatry. But then we have issues like Moses turning his rod into a serpent, and we have the story of Sinai and the golden calf fiasco. So, again, are we to believe that the Israelites were not given to idolatry or to graven images? We've also been told that Christianity, essentially, the type of Christianity that St. Paul invented, which is most of the New Testament, is his writings. We've been told that that's a Roman invention. Is that true? Is the origins of Christianity to be found in Rome? We've been told that race mattered to the ancients. Well, race might matter today, but can we really imagine that race mattered to people who had endured a terrible age of catastrophe in which everything secure and everything beloved had been absolutely wrecked and destroyed? Maybe other things mattered more than race. Maybe interest in race is a more recent phenomena. We've also been told, scandalously so, that the word Aryan denoted a race. One thing we have to definitely be aware of is the prohibition and the suppression of knowledge down throughout the centuries, particularly after the advent of the Christian religion. The scholar Avro Manhattan, in his book Vatican Billions, comments upon this, and he says that pagan temples were either closed, transformed into Christian shrines, or demolished. Their properties were summarily added to the church's patrimony. The wealth of sundry religions were mercilessly expropriated, their clergy dismissed or persecuted, when not civilly or even physically obliterated. So the man is talking about an overt campaign to suppress, to destroy, to plagiarize, and to cannibalize. So the traditions that we have today, are they really unique to Judaism and Christianity? Helen Ellerby, in her book The Dark Side of Christian History, she talks about the prohibition, the campaign of prohibition and suppression. And she says, after Christians had spent years destroying books and libraries, St. John Chrysostom, the preeminent Greek father of the Church, proudly declared, every trace of the old philosophy and literature of the ancient world has vanished from the face of the earth. So this church father is even gleefully celebrating the fact that not a shred of what was has been left. So universal was the policy and the politics of suppression and destruction. So when authors and writers, teachers like myself come out and suggest or imply that what we have is not authentic today, and what we have might be stolen from other races and plagiarized and cannibalized and copied, the evidence is right there, where you know where to go to look for it. In our work, we always talk about the various aspects of this colonization, the various devices that are used by the oligarchs in order to get what they want and to have their ideologies accepted by the mass of mankind. There's also a sort of a machinery of that. It's not simple, but one of the devices that is used could be summed up as Orwellian doublespeak, the manipulation of language, the manipulation of words. And let me give you one very, very good example which will help clear up a lot of anomalies once it's fully understood. And that is that it's so easy for historians, anthropologists, ethnologists, and what have you, to play with words. For instance, the word invasion. Every time we hear about something like, for instance, an Aryan invasion, particularly in the context of northern India, that term is bandied around. It's in countless history books, countless television shows. What would happen, though, if instead of invasion, you merely substitute the word migration? There's all the difference in the world. What happens if these visitations of these Westerners to Eastern climes, you see, weren't invasions? What happens if that image of horseback riding, sword-wielding, barbarous, racist invaders, conquering, butchering, and murdering, of which there is actually very little evidence in northern India to show this. This is also recent discoveries have pointed this out. What happens if, in fact, we've been duped by another form of manipulation involving language and words? Once you become savvy to what we're talking about, you'll see that this is an evidence in so many areas. Substitute the word migration, which implies a completely different kind of movement, a completely different kind of situation than invasion of warring hordes. And interestingly, the Victorian Freemason, Edward Bulwer Lytton, a great author, he addressed this very phenomena. He said, to savage and barbarous tribes, meaning less developed tribes, the first appearance of men whose mechanical inventions, whose superior knowledge of the arts of life, nay, whose exterior advantages of garb and mien indicate intellectual eminence, till then neither known or imagined, presents itself as something preternatural or divine. They yield to a teacher, not succumb to an invader. And this is a central and most important statement from Bulwer Lytton, talking about the fact that, yeah, if you're not as developed, and if individuals come and visit you, and they are able to dig wells, and they're able to show you new farming techniques, and they have mastery with weaponry, and they have mastery on horseback, their physical features and physical physiognomy is different than yours, and they have expertise in so many areas, as mariners or seafarers or what have you, or jewelry makers. It's very easy for those individuals to welcome those people, not be afraid of them, but to see them as sort of godlike, and that as brothers, in fact. And the evidence that's now come out about the Indus Valley and the communities that existed in Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and specifically along the Saraswati River, which is no more. This was a desiccated river that was a vast river in ancient times, but which ran dry. Evidence from the communities around that river in Pakistan show that these people from different climes lived happily side by side, and that the visiting Westerners are definitely to be considered migrants and brothers and fellow merchants and even tutors. Well, my goodness, what does this do to those irrefutable errors? What does that do to the fallacies and fictions that we've been, injected with through the centuries? But continuing with these pernicious devices that throw us off the track and that confuse the picture of the past and that confuse the picture of where we're at now. One of the devices is a geographical one. That means the deliberate positioning of events in areas of Asia Minor and Egypt that perhaps never even took place there. And when you're reading alternative literature, you need to be familiar with some of these things, because that will help you become more accustomed to what we're talking about. There's a learning curve. As I said earlier on, we're not addressing history in a normal orthodox way. We're looking at it alternatively. And we're very vigilant and very critical and aware of some of these devices. It's very important to become aware of them. One of the other devices is a caricature. This involves the flagrant embellishment of certain personalities to disguise their true identity. The Bible contains many spurious characters and descriptions of outlandish habits and fantastic activities that are patently improbable. Another device is etymological. We gave one example of it earlier with the migration invasion scenario, but we have to be always aware that words, terms, phrases, and place names, etc., underwent and still undergo either subtle or drastic editing and transposition. There is a campaign of renaming. This is the deliberate alteration of personal names. This device was used widely. Names of characters were simply changed so that their existence and activities would be impossible to confirm. Titles were reported to be personal names, such as David, Solomon, Joshua, Jesus, Aaron, etc. What happens if these are not personal names, but in fact titles? And what happens if some titles were made into personal names? We have the device of omission. Key events that did occur historically are drastically downplayed or omitted altogether by the biblicists. And of course you're going to scream for evidence of this. Well, this is what the volumes contain, this is what the DVDs contain. We're just giving you a summary here of some things, but we have the information on all of this. I've just given you an example, in fact. It's omitted that the Western visitors to Eastern climes were brothers in arms. We're not told that. A piece of history is omitted. Then we have simple invention. This involves the introduction of people or tribes or even events that never existed or never happened. This is what is known in biblical terms or in Christian terms as pious forgery, or the interpolation of things that are completely fantastic. We have tampering with chronology. Timelines are muddled on purpose. King lists are rearranged, and the lifespan of individuals is modified. Dates for key operations, such as building projects, battles, traversals, famines, coronations, marriages, births, and so on, are also tampered with. Then we have interpretation, where wild, unrealistic interpretations are given to events and ideologies to flagrantly confound understanding. We have crypticism, the introduction of a welter of code words, terms, and phrases that signify little to the layperson, but that communicate secret meanings and intentions to the initiated reader. Examples include words like harlot, prostitute, virgin, drunkard, leper, cave dweller, carpenter, shepherd, the term fisherman or merchant, the term judge, the term serpent, terms like blood and seed and vine and covenant and watcher and even mountain and desert and heavens. All of these terms have what is known as connotative meanings. We have to understand the difference between what's called denotative meanings, which is a strict linguistic direct meaning. A harlot is a harlot. A mountain is a mountain. But when we're dealing with alternative history, and when we're dealing with chronicles and scriptures and books that may have many layers and many authors, we have to understand that they may be communicating something quite different than the literal meaning. And this still has to get across to a lot of people. But the alternative or connotative terms, the connotative meanings of these different terms is also very important to examine, because it can give us a much cleaner and clearer picture of what's being communicated. The word carpenter, for instance, that can imply many things. Jesus was a carpenter, or Joseph was a carpenter. Who are the carpenters? Where did that word come from? What's its original translation, and so forth? Now, Hutton Webster, in his book Early European History, he wrote that learning and education were so closely limited to a few individuals that a mass of the people were sunk in deepest ignorance. Men could not pursue knowledge for themselves, but had to accept everything on authority. Hence the inhabitants of Oriental lands remained a conservative folk, slow to abandon their time-honored beliefs, and very unwilling to adopt a new custom even when clearly better than the old. This absence of popular education, more than anything else, made Oriental civilization unprogressive. So he again is addressing this whole idea of the campaign of suppression and the campaign of hegemony and authority and the suppression of individual thought. This is the ancestry. In my own work, The Irish Origins of Civilization, in Volume 1, I wrote, "Before we choose to merely laugh off the nonsense of the Bible, or flippantly or indignantly dismiss the outlandish forgeries and fictions, let us realize that as preposterous and spurious as most of the content surely is, it was not composed by pathologically impressionable or illiterate men with chronically naive minds. No, in our opinion, the Testaments were commissioned and composed by men of high intelligence for a cozened audience of impressionable, illiterate, and naive men ready to credulously believe the myriad fabulous lies spun by their imperious overlords." Because time and time again, when these fallacies and fables and fictions are pointed out, people generally dismiss it by saying, "Oh well, those authors didn't know much about history, and it's just mistakes. You have to, it's forgivable." But with a book of this great magnitude, and considering all the deeds that are done in the names of various scriptures, including the Bible, is that really to be accepted? The point I'm making is that no, we can never excuse it. The individuals who were behind these stories were very, very intelligent. And they were working on people's emotional level. They were working on faith. They weren't dealing with reason. They weren't dealing with intellect. They were dealing with faith, with belief, and with emotional drives. This is very important to realize. I say also in the same book, in the same chapter of Volume 1, sadly, this penchant for gullibility was not only a problem of bygone days. Man is as irrational and gullible as ever. Sadly, his zeal for demonstrating the level of his ignorance and fanaticism has not abated, not in the least. Now that we have looked at fallacies and frauds and fictions a little bit, we can turn to a little preview of Atlantis, which was, of course, the theme of my first book. And the idea that Britain and Ireland, of course, may be remnants of what we call Atlantis. When we deal with the west to east transit of the elements of civilization, we're dealing with several scholars that are mentioned throughout my books. I've listed them here, I think, in chronological order. The first was Anna Wilkes, in the late 1800s. Anna Wilkes, who wrote a book called Land of the Chaldees, or of the Chaldees, which went into this whole idea of the west to east migration of the elements of civilization, and contemplating the idea that there were highly advanced civilizations, and that modern civilizations, the great empires of old, didn't just arise in the Neolithic period, like we've always been told by the experts, the so-called experts. So we have Anna Wilkes. Then we have the great American writer and thinker Ignatius Donnelly. We have Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who had no problem whatsoever in understanding that there was a west to east transit. We have, to a certain extent, L.A. Waddell, another key investigator into these matters. We have Connor McAdary, and we have, in the 1960s, Commons Beaumont, and the whole subject of the significance of Britain, the age of catastrophe, pre-Diluvian civilizations, and the west to east movement basically lapsed after the time of Connor McAdary. It didn't do well at his time or ever before. His books have always been very hard to find, and he was a contemporary of the great Immanuel Velikovsky. But Beaumont's theories were not accepted, and the whole theory basically lapsed until the present day. My book is an homage to these previous mentors and thinkers, and picks up the whole study, tries to jumpstart or kickstart this whole investigation again. The American scholar, as I said, Ignatius Donnelly, had lots of interesting things to say about the west to east movement of the elements of civilization, and he had written extensively on Atlantis and the so-called pre-Diluvian cultures and civilizations. From his book he wrote, quote, "From all these facts it appears that the population of Ireland came from the west and not from Asia, that it was one of the many waves of population flowing out from the island of Atlantis, and herein we find the explanation of that problem which has puzzled the Aryan scholars. As Ireland is farther from the Punjab than Persia, Greece, Rome, or Scandinavia, it would follow that the Celtic wave of migration must have been the earliest sent out from the Sanskrit center. But it is now asserted by Professor Schleicher and others that the Celtic tongue shows that it was separated from the Sanskrit original tongue later than the others, and that it is more closely allied to the Latin than to any other Aryan tongue. This is entirely inexplicable upon any theory of an Eastern origin of the Indo-European races, but is very easily understood if we recognize the Aryan and Celtic migrations as going out about the same time from the Atlantean fountainhead. There are many points confirmatory of this belief. In the first place, the civilization of the Irish dates back to a vast antiquity. This was from his book Atlantis, the Antediluvian Epoch. The great Commons Beaumont, to whom my work is dedicated, he wrote in his work, "The British Isles and Scandinavia admittedly comprise one of the oldest land surfaces of the world, and as there is reason to believe from archaeological and other evidence, one of the first inhabited by primeval man. They form a part of an ancient continental surface, and at no considerable distance of time, Britain was separated from Norway by no more than the width of a river estuary. Formerly, this region of Old Red, later called Hyperborea by the ancients, enjoyed a wholly delicious climate." Beaumont is talking about the changes in topography, which scientists and geologists know, and oceanographers know, that the world did not look like it does now. You look at a map or you look at a globe, and we again, presumptively and quite erroneously imagine that the continents and the nations have always been divided this way, and that the oceans always look like that, and the seas, to all intents and purposes, always have looked the way that they have. Nothing could be further from the truth. And he addresses, in his book, The Riddle of Prehistoric Britain, he says, "The most ancient seat of civilization in the north, the cradle of the Aryan race, was that tattered group of islands which bear the name of Shetlands. The Shetlands, or the Set lands, are primordial. Britain is primordial. Ireland is primordial, according to Beaumont. The earliest homelands." And of course he was talking there in those quotes about the state of the world before the great cataclysm that I've been mentioning. But what happened after the age of catastrophe? I say that one important question concerns what happened to Atlantis. As we show in our work, there are two important areas of study. There's the physical destruction of Atlantis, and then there is the psychological trauma caused to human consciousness due to the worldwide catastrophe that changed the face of the planet. And people familiar with my work on Atlantis know that I'm not that interested in the physical aspects of the cataclysm. A tsunami, a giant wave, some sort of earthquakes. I mean, it doesn't take much imagination. We've seen smaller versions of this even today. What really has fascinated me with all of this ancient history, and why, again, it has so much to do with where we're at today, it has a lot to do with your life, it has to do with your thinking, your thought, geneticists never stop telling you about the importance of your genetic heredity and your lineage. Do you think that's any less the case psychologically? Do you think it's any less the case intellectually or morally? We are the outcome of our forefathers. It doesn't take a genius or a rocket scientist to work out that almost every trope of our lives, certainly the elements of civilization, how could we have music? How could we have any form of technology today? It didn't come into being overnight. It's a slow, gradual development. As I said, the geneticists are always talking about our genetic heritage. Well, it's the same thing in other areas as well. We are the outflow, the concomitant, the symptom of the past. And if in the past there was something that so traumatized the human mind, and as I talk about in the first book on Atlantis, something so severe that it gave birth to evil, to man's penchant for sadism and injustice. If man's consciousness was so disturbed, I'm very interested in that question. How did man become the psychological creature that he is today? A psychologist would say it's psychological, but perhaps something physiological happened that is embedded, encoded, encrypted within our own genetic memory, or what's called our racial memory. And since this destruction of Atlantis may have happened as recently as 13,500 years ago, that's a very short time, historically speaking, in the phylogenetic timeline. It's a very, very short period of time ago. So perhaps, again, aspects of man's personality, as we said earlier in the introduction of this presentation, the darker emotions which we're trained to fear and not look at, that we kind of divorce from ourselves. And then again, on a social level, the civilizations, the cultures, the political establishment we give rise to. I, in my work, trace all of this back to to a primal trauma that happened in ages past. So your interest could be the physical destruction and seeking out that mystery, or it could be, like myself, more of a focus on what man became after the age of cataclysm. Immanuel Velikovsky, probably one of the most lambasted and despised of all the alternative historians ever to have lived, he wrote in his work, he said, "In the fields of archaeology, geology, and astronomy, the last few years have brought a vast array of facts to corroborate the claims that there were physical upheavals of a global character in historical times, and that these catastrophes were caused by extraterrestrial agents, and that the nature of these agents may be identified. The memory of the cataclysms was erased, not because of lack of written traditions, but because of some characteristic process that later caused entire nations, together with their literate men, to read into these traditions allegories or metaphors, where actually cosmic disturbances were clearly described." And when Velikovsky talks about extraterrestrial agents, he's speaking about cometary action, some sort of upheaval celestially within the solar system. The great Conor McDowry, he wrote that the fact is, he said, that Ireland was the first power that colonized along both sides of the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore the colonies came from the west instead of from the east, as our astute Roman and British historians would have us believe. And the world has believed it up till now. Investigators have followed the fast clue sent out from this source and found nothing in the east to support this claim that the Aryans emigrated from the east and colonized towards the west. The real and true evidence points just in the opposite direction. There is no mistaking, he said, the monuments left by the Irish, who were once the rulers and masters of the whole earth. Their rule embraced all countries. It was worldwide. Ireland was the first mistress of the seas. It was the first and only worldwide empire which has ever been known. For it was spiritual. It was greater in extent than the Persian, Greek, Roman, or Mughal ever attained to. Now do you see why it's so important? McDowry hits the nail on the head. He sums up the whole scenario perfectly. Why the historical fraud? Why the historical deception? Why the rise of tyrannical, obsessive, territorial empires that are so exploitative of nature, of other races, and so on? Well, we look back through history and find it difficult to find any civilization, you see, that wasn't like that wasn't bloodthirsty and cruel and sadistic and murderous and conquestative. But what what McDowry is saying here is that, in the pre-Diluvian era, it wasn't like that. There have been, in fact, cultures and civilizations where the great adepts set up their schools and colleges for the higher education, the moral education and instruction of all people. And of course, wouldn't this be then reflected in their attitude towards nature, in their attitude towards the heavens and the stars, and their attitude towards one another? Wouldn't this be represented in the kind of pantheons that they had, the gods that they worshipped, you see, and their treatment of themselves and anything that was sacred, anything that was alive? So what would happen if there was, in fact, in ancient times, cultures that were spiritually oriented? Perhaps there's a reason why we're not being told about their existence today, and why all trace of is wiped out. Now, of course, speaking specifically of Atlantis, it's gone by many names. The names are endless. People can refer to the book that I've done or the DVD. We go into Atlantis specifically there. But it's been known as Aztlan. Beaumont spoke of Hyperborea, which is just simply a word that means extreme north. It has been referred to as Arcadia, as Arctos, as Hesperides, the famous Garden of Hesperides. One can see elements of it in the story of Avalon and in Numenor. All of this refers to the paradisical lands that once existed before they were destroyed. Turning to the legends of Ireland, we find that there was not one sunken land or one sunken empire, but there was at least four. In Irish mythology, it's very specific that Atlantis was actually made up of four continents, four subcontinents, like sort of archipelagios in a way. And they were known in Gaelic as Phalius, Murius, Phineus, and Gorius. And this is dealt with in the Atlantis book, but for now I just want to draw your attention to the second name there, Murias, because those who are familiar with the story of the antediluvian kingdom will recognize that word. If you add the letter L on the front of that word, and in ancient times it was the same as it is today in French, where the letter L just represented the word the. It was like a prefix the, T-H-E. In fact, the letter D was often added onto the beginnings of certain words that meant the, and in some languages the word H, which is often silent in English, also represented the. But certainly in this case, L represented the. So, Le Murias, we find has been there for thousands and thousands of years. In Irish mythology, the story of the sunken land of Le Murias, or the Muria. And a modern, a much later translation of Muria just simply meant homeland or motherland. So La Muria would just mean the land of the mother, or the motherland. That could represent the whole earth, or it could represent, again, a country of enlightened adepts, from which all religion, all culture, all theology, and, as we've been saying, the elements of civilization, was that their fountainhead? Was that the wellspring from which it all came? The ancestral world, the ancestral land. Turning from that small review of my Atlantis book, we can turn now to take a closer look at Ireland and some of the hidden facts about that land, the land of the ancient Arya. Edmund Spenser, writer and British government official in Ireland, AD 1596, he wrote, "The Irish are one of the most ancient nations that I know of at this end of the world, and are from as mighty a race as the world ever brought forth." Peter Beresford Ellis, an expert on the Druids, said the Irish system is the oldest surviving complete codified legal system in Europe, with its roots in ancient Indo-European custom and not in Roman law, and is therefore the oldest surviving Celtic system of jurisprudence. Edmund Curtis, A History of Ireland from the Earliest Times to 1922, Curtis wrote, "The traditions of the Irish people are the oldest of any race in Europe, north and west of the Alps, and they themselves are the longest settled on their own soil." Now the word Ireland comes from Ari, or Arya land, meaning the land of the Arya, or the Aryans. In Indo-European languages, the term Alian meant Lord or God. The capital letter A was transposed to E, and so we have Eri, or Ire, or Eirain, and Erin. The ancient Irish, being inherently romantic and spiritual, believed their land to be a living goddess, referred to as Ari or Eri. In various myths, where this goddess and others appear and speak, they do so as personifications of the land itself. We can plainly see that from Eirain or Erin comes the word Aryan. An Aryan was a man under the goddess, a keeper of her mysteries. Eri or Ari referred to the land of Ireland, and Arya or Aryan to a man of the land, which is to an elder initiated into the mysteries of the earth and the sky. We get words such as terra, like in terrestrial, and terra firma, from this ancient goddess's name. The Greek goddess Hera, even the term Tara, or Tura, or in Cappadocia near Turkey, Petera, and Eridu, and Eridanus, and Erik. This is in Babylon, and the Garden of Hesperides. One needs to look out for this Eri and Ari word root, the etymology being very, very important. And as an elder, a druid and his confederates had a most important job to attend to, namely the healing of the earth. And in Book 1, in the chapter on the druids, we look at this job, this duty that druids performed. The druids were caretakers of an earth that had been damaged, torn, rent, and ravaged. As doctors or surgeons attend a casualty of an automobile wreck, so the men who have come to be known as the druids attempted to heal the earth's grievous wounds. They did not regard catastrophes as we do today in our spiritless times. To them, there was no such thing as a random act of fate or nature. Everything that occurred had meaning. That's right, all that happened in the natural world did so to instruct and guide. The Arya, the elders, the druids, these were the purified ones who'd made themselves eligible to work with the subtle energies of the earth. The Druidic order of Aryan elders reverenced the earth and commissioned the construction of the many Mesolithic and megalithic sites that cover Britain, France, and Scandinavia. They were the Magi who instructed the world's hierophants how to undo what had been done and how again to set up or set aright the pillar. Now, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, a Vedic text, we find that the word Arya referred to those who are advancing spiritually. The Aryan family is distributed all over the world and is known as Indo-Aryan. In prehistoric days, all of the members of the Aryan family followed the Vedic principles, and therefore they became spiritually advanced. The glorification of the Supreme Lord can be much appreciated by the Aryan family. Although there is no bar for others, the members of the Aryan family very quickly catch the essence of spiritual life. The ancient text goes on to say, an Aryan civilization is a civilization advanced in spiritual knowledge. Well, what about that? Now, we addressed this in the introduction, that we would be contending, we would be restoring this term, this terribly abused and misused term. And one could say so much about this. One could get into the whole story of the mistreatment of that word, both in England and in Nazi Germany and so on and so forth, but we don't want to go there. Let's just keep it simple and pure. These ancient texts, and one wonders, of course, why these texts were not consulted by the so-called experts, but the whole point of this presentation and so much of my work is to show that when it comes to expertise and things, you know, it's almost like that's right there. When you hear the term expert, when you hear the official statement, a lot of it is doublespeak. A lot of it is the manipulation of these terms. A lot of it is omission. A lot of it is clear, simple fabrication. And it starts with the etymology. It starts with the place names. It starts with the words. Like we said, it involves the arbitrary creation of borders and boundaries, which didn't exist in ancient times, all to distort what we know about ourselves and about truth. But look at this. The pure, unadulterated meaning of the word Aryan had nothing whatever to do with race. Quite the contrary. It was a word that had everything to do with caste. Specifically, it was a term that addressed people who were on a spiritual path. And it meant anyone of any country, any background, any nation. Those things, as we said in the introduction, did not mean as much. What mattered to ancient man, particularly after the Great Cataclysm that had seen so much mortality. We're not talking about a tsunami that takes a few thousand lives. We're not talking about a war or battle or disaster, you know, in which there are certain casualties. We're talking about a global catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Is there any heart and mind looking at the carnage, the death of the animals, which has been recorded by many scientists, and the huge death amongst the genocide, not the genocide, but the mega death that was caused by these, the tumult and the cataclysm of nature? Are you going to then be a prejudiced mind that still harbors some sort of grievance against fellow human beings after such a devastating attack? Such a frenzied and devastating thing that has occurred to the human race? Of course not. Well, what you might be interested in, as you were interested in, as your forefathers were interested in the prehistorical days, and which if only we were still interested in, was moral superiority, spiritual advancement. And this is very fundamental, because now as we delve into these great mysteries, which make so much sense of our time, we find something incredible. That this word Ari was a word that represented the female goddess, and that through her it was implied that you were of reverence to the earth and to the sky, that you were an adept, that you had a duty to perform, an active duty, and of course you had to then, not just any old idiot could do that duty. So you had to be a person who had matriculated and advanced and had purified, and just like certain people, are able to communicate excellently today with animals, well, that's what we're talking about. A highly sensitized, highly advanced individual, a shaman, somebody who gets up at night to watch the stars, the minute movements of the planets and the luminaries, somebody who knows an enormous amount about the herbs of the world. And if you study Irish mythology, it's clear that they had a tremendous knowledge of herbs in the most ancient of days. You had to be an Ari, a noble one. These ancient texts of the Vedas, they may be situated in India, of course, but as we said, on the Saraswati River, on the Ganges, on the Indus River, were giant communities, in which Western men, the great noblemen, the great ambassadors of truth from the far West, whose appearance was very different, but they've left their genes, they've left their racial traditions and so on there. These individuals were revered. They were men of knowledge, men of architecture, men of astronomy, and so on. And their name, start with the word, start with the etymology, and the whole contorted knot, the Gordian knot of lies begins to unravel. Or continue believing what the history books tell you about this term and this word, and about everything else that they put forward. Now, Swami B.V. Giri, in his book The Aryan Invasion, an expert, of course, on the ancient Vedic texts like the Srimad Bhagavatam, he says the Sanskrit word Aryan refers to one who is righteous and noble. It is also used in the context of addressing a gentleman, Arya Putra, Arya Kanya, etc. According to Mueller's etymological explanation, and he's talking there about the historian Max Mueller, Mueller's etymological explanation, the meaning of Arya is given as excellent, best, followed by respectable. It's a noun, like master, lord. It means worthy, honorable, excellent, the upholder of Aryan values. And further, it denotes a teacher, an employer, a master, a father-in-law, a friend. Something distinguished, something excellent in life. So again, the lies told to us about the exceptional megalithic ancestors are really without number. The lies disseminated about the Arya specifically are also most pernicious. The very word Aryan has been thoroughly and deliberately misinterpreted. It referred not to race, but as I said, to caste. Specifically, it referred to the intellectual, spiritual, and moral status of any human being, regardless of their racial background. Contemplate it, think about it, read up on it, discover it. We talk about it in the Volume 1. We address it in the introduction. We address it throughout the book. We have a chapter on it in Volume 1 of the Irish Origins of Civilization. Find out how you've been had, how this word has been bandied around and so used and so abused that it's almost like taboo now even to mention this term. This is the kind of level of dumbing down and control that exists in our world. You wanted evidence? We're giving it to you. Check it out. Now, furthermore, more facts, more etymology, more philology, more linguistics. In Proto-Indo-European, this is a very ancient root language, the root of Arya is Aryo. In Iranian, and we'll look at the word Iranian because it's nothing different than the word Aryan, as a matter of fact. These vowels tend to interchange. But in Iranian, the rendition was Asha. In Hindi, the root is Urta, R-T-A. In Greek, the renditions are arete or arite, meaning virtue, Aristos, meaning the best, like Aristotle, the philosopher, and ortho, from which we get words like orthodox, meaning the straight, the right, the correct. In Latin, they drop the A the vowel goes, and you have rectus or erectus, meaning upstanding, right and true. In German it was recht, meaning right. It also appeared as Reich, or more correctly Arik or Arak, as in Rick. You see, Richard, Rick, or Arik, or the Nordic Erik, meaning high or rich. This is where we get the English word rich. So an Aryan was a rich man, rich in morality, rich in spiritual understanding. In English, there it is, but it's, again, the vowel disappears from the beginning, and we have the word right, recht and right, and also the terms such as eres, art, aristocracy, arable, the word area, like an area of land, and names such as Haris, Harrison. In Sanskrit it was Arya, meaning kind, favored, excellent, or devoted. Secondary meanings, as we said, lord, master, noble, respected. The root appears in personal names such as Aryabhata, in Zachariah, or Zacharias, and in Aaron, and in numerous place names such as Benares. And check up on Benares in an encyclopedia. Just go to the Wikipedia, and if you have never heard of the term Benares, the city in India, check out what Benares was, its significance to all Indian people, its significance to theology and religion and writing, and to gods and pantheons and temples. Find out about Benares and then question why it has the term Ari in it. Then we have place names like Ara and Aryavarta, which is an old name for India, which just meant the place of the Arya. Sumeria, Bulgaria, Armenia. Go to Wikipedia, look up Armens, A-R-M-E-N-S, and an incredible story will unfold, a story that not only corroborates what we're talking about here, but also goes and delves into subjects such as genocide, because we're talking about some pretty heavy information here. Find out who the Armenians were. Find out who their enemies were, and another fascinating story will start to unfold. Armenia, Iran, as we said, Ireland, Ireland, and Eric, etc. If this fascinates you, by all means consult the books themselves, where we have lengthy investigations into this kind of thing. Another fantastic example of this is the word we have called vicar. A vicar. Anybody ever question what that word means or where it came from? Well, the Roman Pope is referred to as the vicar of Christ, and many members of the clergy, you see, use this term, especially of the Protestant faith, the vicar, the one who's a vicar of Christ. And the word vicar implies a mediator. In other words, through the vicar, through your vicar, one has a vicarious relationship with Christ. That's worrisome enough, but let's leave that aside. That you should need any intermediary is already worrisome enough. But let's just stick to this particular anecdote, which is that you have a vicarious relationship with Christ. Not direct, but a vicarious relationship with Christ. The word vicar is correctly rendered vice-ari. It's really made of two words. It's a composite word, like many words are. It really contains two syllables, vis or vice, and ari. The syllable vice means in place of, hence the word vicarious. And ari, obviously, we've established, means the Druids or the elders of old. So the word vice-ari, or vicar, actually means in place of the true aristocracy, in place of the Druids, in place of. So now we find, again, something very interesting, that the people who've set them up as the world's potentates, the ones who've set themselves up as the spiritual authorities between the populace of the world, the masses of illiterate individuals, and that all-empowering, all-powerful, omnipotent mystery out there, refer to themselves as the vice-ari, in place of the ari, meaning we're not the ari, but we're in place of them. We're their stand-ins. That's fascinating. The Pope is therefore the stand-in, or the replacement, for the Druid priest. Another example of this word is viceroy. It's exactly the same as we've been talking about. Look up the word viceroy. which connotes a stand-in, you see, or representative for the Roy, because the word Roy meant regent or king, just like Rex and Roy and Reg. These are the roots of the word the king. So a viceroy, like the Viceroy of India, is a representative, a noble man, a government official, you see, who stands in for the king, meaning he's not the king. Right, so vicary, the viceroy. So when you're in front of these people, when you're giving them your allegiance, just realize they're straw men, hollow men. They're not the real McCoy, and they're letting you know it through the etymology, through the symbolism. Back to the Srimad Bhagavatam, and you can see excerpts of this book online. From the stanzas and passages of the Srimad Bhagavatam, it says, Aryans do not kill even a single plant unnecessarily. There we are again, back to the difference between the murderous, treacherous, self-serving, narcissistic criminal syndicates that we have running the world today, compared to, as we said, the pre-Diluvian, antediluvian philosopher kings, you see, that this world is now, not graced by anymore. They say Aryans do not kill even a single small plant unnecessarily, not to speak of cutting trees for sense gratification. Aryans do not distinguish between lower and higher grades of life. Aryans do not distinguish between lower and higher grades of life. Ever think and contemplate the difference between hierarchy and holarchy? Well, we've got evolutionists, we've got hierarchies, we've got you, somebody above you and you below, and then somebody per sucker below you. We're living in hierarchies here. Ever thought about that might be one of the reasons why the life is in the horrendous, dysfunctional state that it's in? What's the difference between holarchy and hierarchy? Well, there was a very big difference, and these Aryans knew all about it. All life should be protected. All living beings have a right to live, even the trees and plants. This is the basic principle of the Aryan civilization. Well, we have had a couple of comments here, and we still no reference to racial differences. Wonder where that's going to come up. The great scholar Albert Churchward, in his fine book, The Origin and Evolution of Religion, says something absolutely remarkable about Egypt, the Ari in Egypt. It is stated on a parchment found in a brick wall in the foundations of Dindira at the time of King Pepi. And the quote on the parchment was, "The Great Pyramid was built by the followers of Horus. The stellar cult people were followers of Horus in the same sense as the Christians are followers of Christ," says Churchward. The architect who drew the plans for the Great Pyramid was Nu-Er-Nub-Ari. His name was Nu-Er-Nub-Ari. And his title, that's not the meaning of his name, this is an additional title, was Keeper of the Secrets. And Egyptologists know that the syllables or the letters at the beginning and end of Egyptian names are the key. They're very important. And there we find the Ari word root, because we understand that there were these ancient connections. There was a worldwide global college. The Druids were not just located to Ireland on the west coast of Europe, nor just to Anglesey, you see, not just to Britain and to France. Nothing could be further from the truth. If wandering monks in the post-Christian times could march and walk and wander throughout the world, if the wandering Israelites could manage it, as we're allegedly told they did from Babylon and Assyria, if these guys could manage it to cross Europe eastward, why is it not to be accepted that in much earlier days the same thing happened, but in the other direction, and from a people that we're not meant to know about? Talking about the amazing sophistication of Egypt, just in case anybody hasn't understood that yet, we turn to the work of Edward F. Malkowski, who wrote a book called Before the Pharaohs, and he is addressing the granite sarcophagi of the Saqqara Serapeum. There's many Serapeums, just means underground labyrinth or whatever. There's one in Alexandria, I think there was one in Greece, and the oldest one, in fact the oldest necropolis known to man, one of the oldest burial sites, containing some of the oldest pyramids that have ever been discovered, and there's about 16 of them at the site, I think, is at Saqqara. Wait a minute, Saqqara. There's that term Ara again, Saqqara. But at Saqqara, there's this famous Serapeum, and underneath it, when they went down into the chambers, they found these granite sarcophagi, these sort of boxes, some of them weighing as much as about 70 tons. I mean, the lids alone are unmovable. So Malkowski has something incredible to say about these. They have been analyzed by independent industrialists and so on, and machinists. He says that inside the Serapeum, chambers with ceilings nearly 25 feet high were carved into both sides of a main corridor. These open rooms are where the massive stone sarcophagi for the Apis bulls once stood. Each sarcophagus was carved from a single block of granite, and each lid weighed many tons. In 1995, Dunn, this is an independent American machinist and expert on design, armed with a 6-inch precision straight edge, inspected the interior surfaces of 2 sarcophagi, the 27-ton lid of one of the sarcophagi, and the inside lid surface of the granite box on which it sat was precisely square to 0.00005 of an inch. He also verified that its corners were precise to 5/32 of an inch. Therefore, according to Dunn, replicating the precision of the granite boxes in the Serapeum would be extremely difficult even today. The granite box found in the Great Pyramid has the same characteristics as the boxes in the Serapeum. So he's saying that that famous, well-known granite box in the center, in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, or is it the Queen's Chamber? I can't remember exactly which, but the famous box that's been so debated is of the same type as found in the Serapeum. The granite box, he said, yet these boxes are assigned to Egypt's 18th dynasty over 1,000 years after Egyptian stoneworking was supposed to be in decline. Since their dating is based on pottery found nearby and not on boxes themselves, Dunn believes it is reasonable to speculate that the boxes are not correctly dated. And I can add that you can be pretty sure that that's true, because this kind of scandalous dating, exactly the same kind of tampering has happened with Egyptian king lists and timelines. So, of course, it takes a rocket scientist, a great genius with some sort of, corporate funding to come along and date a granite box, and does so by some shattered pottery that happens to be lying beside it. They date the pottery and then tell you that that's the date of the granite boxes. That passes for science and archaeology nowadays. He goes on to say that their stonework has left marks of careful and remarkable manufacturing methods. It is unmistakable and irrefutable. He believes that the artifacts he measured in Egypt are the smoking gun that proves without a shadow of a doubt that a higher civilization than what we have been taught existed in ancient Egypt. Malkowski goes on to say, rock art dating from 5000 BCE corroborates what the radar equipment revealed. In Libya, Egypt, and Mali, petroglyphs depict not only grazing animals, but also aquatic life, such as crocodiles. This indicates that the desert was inhabited during the time prior to 4000 BC, and as far back as 8000 BC when the climate was wet. And of course, in the Indus Valley, we know that the dates given, like 700 BC and even 1000 BC for the settlements there of the area, are now known to be, preposterously late. Preposterously late. The recent discoveries show that it goes back to 8 to 10,000. Exactly what Malkowski is saying here about the Egypt and Libya and Mali, that settlements were there 5, 6, 7, 8,000 BC. So it has now been proven in Pakistan at the Indus Valley, you see. 10,000 years BC. They even know from the Vedas that the Vedas record stories about the Saraswati River when it was flowing. How could it have details like that at such an early time? They're eyewitness accounts. The Vedas contain eyewitness accounts of things that happened 6 to 8 to 10,000 years BC. And of course, I've dealt with this in my Atlantis DVD, and make reference to not only the work of Allen and Delaire, their books Cataclysm and When the Earth Nearly Died, but to a fascinating book called Saharasia. Saharasia by James DeMille, who is a follower of Wilhelm Reich. And the subtitle of Saharasia is The 4000 BCE Origins of Child Abuse, Sex Repression, Warfare and Social Violence in the Deserts of the Old World. He deals with this fact that, again, the planet doesn't look like what it does now. Mountains are higher than they ever were before, where beautiful temperate gardens and fertile crescents existed. Now we have deserts, you see, the desertification and desiccation of the world. And Malachowski says also that around 7,000 years ago, people from Mesopotamia and Palestine also arrived to the Libyan Mali area. This is near Egypt, introducing cattle and goats. Delernia points out that the rock art in the area, by the profile of the face and the style, depicts white people. There are similarities between cultures of the Euphrates and those of the Nile, such as their architectural conception. Important buildings and tombs in Egypt were decorated with paneled palace facade architecture, essentially the same as the ornamental buttresses and buttressing on Sumerian temples and palaces. So they're mentioning that this was a multicultural setup here. And so why could it not be the same story for Egypt? The proof is slowly leaking out. As I said in my Atlantis book, we're in the days now. We're going to count down to a time in which we're going to have so many revelations that devastate sacred cows, but also give us a clear understanding of what was going on in the primeval times.